What is a recurring moral conflict?
A recurring moral, well, I don't know if it raises, I think this is a moral conflict. This is called the tragedy of the commons. It's this phenomena where um, uh, individual rational actors maximizing individual or taking rational decisions from an individual perspective can lead to group behavior that is suboptimal for the group. And that is problematic because it leaves you in bad places. Either the way, so the only options then are you do nothing, in which case some resource or outcome is going to be bad. Like this usually comes up in the context of climate change. Every single actor may be making locally optimal decisions. You have countries that are not developed who want to be developed and therefore have to spend resources, pollute their environment to get to the developed stage. You have to lift people out of poverty. But if everybody does that, then we will end up with a planet that is uninhabitable. And the way around that is to either let that happen, in which case the group ends up with an outcome which is bad ultimately, or to establish some sort of centralized authority that comes in and says, you cannot do this. Yes, that may be locally optimal for you, but it is not globally optimal for everybody else. And therefore, certain individuals have to suffer. And that's typically where you have to come in and define, well, who gets to suffer. And the history of the world suggests that the agents or the actors or the individuals who suffer are the ones who've had a late start. If you've had an early start on the board, you suffer less. So yeah, I don't know of a good solution to these problems. And this happens at various scales.
What is a recurring moral conflict?
A recurring moral conflict? Moral conflict. I have sort of internal struggles relevant to morality, but I don't know about a specific moral conflict. I'm going to not exactly answer your question. I'll answer something slightly different because I've been thinking about it a lot more. But I struggle with working in an ethics space while also being at a corporation that has a drive to make profit, and that can be really at odds with like doing the right thing, being transparent. A lot of the things that we value in sort of the ethical AI space can really be at odds with sort of a capitalist kind of society or within these large corporations. And so it's a bit of a balancing act to figure out how to advance different kinds of ethics-based concepts forward within the company while also towing the line of this sort of counteracting goal that the company has. And so, it's required sort of some compromises. So, for example, I worked on the face recognition stuff, looking at like how well it worked and things like that. And we had to make the case about whether to launch it or not at all. I was on the don't launch at all camp. It was decided that they were going to launch in some way, but we had to figure out how. So then it was like, okay, if you are going to release face recognition in any way, then what is the best way to do it? So in this case, it was decided that it can only be used for tracking actors and actresses in films. So those are the only people that can be recognized, and it's only given to media partners, so a specific use case. But that was part of kind of the release, which was like, okay, I don't think it should be released, but given that there is some good reasons in terms of the company to release it, what are then the right constraints to put on it. So it can be like a bit of a struggle between how do we do this the right way if we have to do it versus like making the case that we shouldn't do it at all.
Right. That makes sense. Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict?
I don't think I have one. Most of what I do is work. I think my work is pretty good. I think my work is generally good. I think technology is a good thing. I do technology. Hopefully I contribute to moving it forward. I think technology is by and large a force for good, a force for improvement in people's living conditions. So actually, I'm pretty good in that regard.
Yeah, back to the thermostat being set at happy.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict?
Oh, a moral conflict. Recurrent.
Yeah, something you tend to think about often, haven't quite figured out.
That I haven't. I don't know. I guess that one thing will be, how close you are to your family, maybe, because we live all far away. And this is something that I think sometimes about, the fact that, my parents are so far away, my brother, my sister also lives here in Boston, so she's fine. Family is, we are kind of far away from each other.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something that I think about.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict?
A recurring what?
A recurring moral conflict.
Model conflict?
Moral, like something MORAL, so something that you think is like what is right, what is wrong, and like you struggle, moral conflict.
A recurring moral conflict. Oh, for me, a big thing is the conflict between what you know is good for someone and what they want to do, so their freedom of choice. Because if you know something's bad for them and you see them like doing it to themselves, but you also don't want to deny them their free choice, it's very hard for me to decide what the right thing to do is, if there is such a thing. So, for example, my dad often behaves like a 4-year-old, and I know he should exercise and eat better, but he doesn't want to. And I can't really order my dad around because he's my dad. But he takes terrible care of his health, and sometimes I just want to like force him to do stuff. But autonomy is really important. So for me, there's this kind of really tough balance between what you know is good for someone and respecting their choice. And there's all these ways that you can trick them into doing it, but there's this thing like, is it okay to manipulate them into doing what's good for them, if it's good for them or not? So for me, that's something that actually presents itself quite frequently because of my dad and other people who make bad choices. And often for me, that's the biggest thing is I don't know what the right thing to do is for that, if there is such a thing, but what the best trade-off is between tricking them into doing the right thing, letting them have their way, or really making them.
Yeah, makes sense. What is a recurring moral conflict?
What is a recurring moral conflict? Good question. I think that for all of us who are in these very privileged situations, right, in terms of we have very comfortable jobs, we are financially comfortable, we are, even in this COVID time, we have not really had to miss much of a beat. So we are very lucky in a certain sense, and many people in the world are not so lucky. And I think that we have to acknowledge that so much is just luck. I mean, I think that, at least to me, I'm conscious that where I'm now is so much a result of luck rather than just, my own hard work.
Yeah. Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict?
Moral conflict. I would say that I get, I guess, just because I've been in this field for a while, and that probably happens to you too. Like, we get requests for either speaking at interesting events or summer schools. A lot of students asking whether, could be an advisor for them. A lot of really talented, students that could, I'm sure, do great things. And, but there are obviously like too many of these opportunities really to take them all. So each time just, thinking about whether I should make the effort of squeezing that into my responsibilities or that, like this would just go over into my personal life specifically. And because there was definitely a time where I was not present enough home, and my day would extend way beyond 6 p.m. many days. And I've been trying to be more systematic about not doing that and be as respectful as possible as to the reasonable amount of time we should be working versus being home and having a personal life. But that means like there's these opportunities where you feel like it would be a relatively, let's say, a speaking engagement, it would be relatively easy to fill that in, but then it would mean some preparation. It would, wreak some havoc in your schedule, which means it would probably push over the time I would actually want to work. And so I think that's one that's always like each time having to say no is a bit tough.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
What do you mean by model conflict?
Moral conflict, like in terms of like moral, yeah.
Moral conflict, ooh. A moral conflict. Yeah, I don't know if it's a moral conflict, but certainly I struggle a lot with how much space to give my children to kind of explore, make their own mistakes, figure it out, versus like telling them what to do. And there's a part of me that just wants to like really organize them and structure them, and because I feel like that's a good path for them, but at the same time I feel like they also need space to learn, and they need to be able to be who they want to be, and I struggle a lot with balancing between those two things.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
A moral conflict.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess one thing that comes to mind, and this is sort of maybe unique to those of us who are sitting in two jobs. And I don't know if it's a moral conflict, but I feel like there's some risks that pop up that I wasn't anticipating when I took the second gig. And I want to be careful not to say anything that's confidential, but when you're working for two organizations, and really when you're a PhD advisor, you're working for more than two organizations because you're also working for the people you mentor. Situations arise where you have dual loyalty, and those things can work against each other. So I'll try and construct a hypothetical example that hopefully isn't too personal. But you're mentoring a student, they're graduating, they're looking for a job. You like working with this student, you'd be happy to continue, but you also know that typically in academia, we send people away after their PhD and encourage them to build their network, do a postdoc, or become an assistant professor somewhere else, or go work in industry. Mm-hmm. But when you have a dual role in industry, suddenly you have a loyalty to your organization and your team to try and hire great people, right? Mm-hmm. And so how do you walk the line where you're doing the right thing by your team, but you're also biased towards this student? So do you completely trust your judgment that this is the best thing for the team? So you want to do the best thing for the team, you want to do the best thing for the student, and you kind of can't be two people at the same time, and you can't separate these two things perfectly. And if you have any self-awareness at all, you recognize this is a conflict of interest. Is it a moral one? Well, I don't think so. I think it's just a tricky situation, right? And so my advice and what I tried to do in these situations is just be completely open with everybody about the possibility of the conflict. Try and be very explicit when you're giving the student advice. Okay, I'm putting on my advisor hat now. Forget about this other thing. When you're talking to the team, you say, okay, right now I'm this person's advisor. This is my recommendation. Now I'm talking on behalf of the team, and these two things may not be totally, there may be some dissonance between the two sometimes, and defer to others, hand off responsibility on handling, that case. These are the kinds of things that it took a lot of time to figure out how to think about that, and I'm still not sure I'm there. And like a lot of energy went into that, way more than normally right? That's one thing that kind of pops into my mind. I think there's maybe a bigger question hiding in there about the role of the technology that we build in our society. And that's very much, in the news these days. How do we do AI ethically? What are our responsibilities as researchers? What's going on with our data? I don't want to say I feel conflict. I think I feel worried that what can we do? What can we control? How can we make sure that our technology is used in a way that's responsible? And there are a lot of things we can't control. And who should decide, and what's the future of the field seems just, I don't know what's going to happen. And there's all kinds of competing interests there, and people are now building careers on these questions, whereas they used to be, after hours conversation at the conference, if that. And now it's a very central thing. I think people in my group are very passionate on some of these issues, and we've contributed research in this area now. I think it's exciting. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have said, I don't think we're going to see that happen in my lifetime, that the technology will be that relevant to day-to-day life. And I was wrong. Things have moved very fast. I'm not totally convinced we're ready for prime time. We may be jumping the gun in putting a lot of things out there. I think people are way overestimating on the whole the capacity of the things we built to serve humans. I think we're maybe pushing it out sooner than we should, but there are many pressures working toward that. I don't know. Maybe it's all fine. I don't know. I have some deep-seated anxiety, I guess, and a lot of mixed feelings, but I don't think that I'm personally in a state of conflict, because I'm trying to be very open about these issues and encourage others to tackle them head on in their work, and try and be transparent, right? I guess I feel like transparency is the bare minimum where we should start as researchers, but I haven't felt like deep conflict yet. There was a time when I worried, when I was starting out, I worried about the tension between doing work that I thought was scientifically valid and the sources of funding, and whether they might pressure us to prioritize other ends over the best science. And that was something I worried about starting out, and it never really became a major issue. I never worked with sponsors who I felt were putting a thumb on the scales or pressuring us in a way that was uncomfortable. But it was something my idealistic young self thought that might happen, and worried about some of the sources of funding. And fortunately, in the U.S., we by and large don't, at least in my career, haven't felt that kind of pressure in our field. At least I haven't.
Yeah. Makes sense. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
Sorry, what do you mean by model conflict?
Moral conflict, MORAL, like trying to figure out what's right.
Sorry.
Yeah.
There's so many of them. Okay, when I was in graduate school, I really struggled with having, doing what I love versus, and I wanted to both do what I loved and also feel like I was doing good for the world. And I didn't find a topic. I first was a graduate student in physics, and then I went to MIT at the Media Lab later. So within physics, I didn't find a way to both do what I loved and feel like I was helping the world. And so I finally kind of gave up on that and decided to sort of split it into two. And for work, I would do what I loved, and then I would go try to help the world, outside of work, in my free time, or through donations, or through political actions or something. And so, and then finally I became a professor, which is actually, I think, a really helping profession in many ways. You're trying to train people and teach them and do research, and I think that's just intrinsically, it's doing good for the world. I sort of fell into that. I guess the moral conflict, well, I mean, yeah. So, and now as a professor, I, take money from the military, and I've kind of, I see it the way I rationally thought it when I was younger, but I couldn't really act on it. I realized that we needed a military, and I just didn't want to be involved in it. And now I think taking money from the military is not really being involved in the military very much. But anyway, I see it's a richer topic than just the black and white yes no, and so that's something I guess I've switched positions on. I guess a moral conflict is that everything's good for me and it's not good for everyone else necessarily.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
I don't think there is anything like that which bothers me too much, but sometimes it does happen that I tend to think about what I am doing, how I am contributing in AI or research, and how that relates to some of the bigger problems in the world, particularly coming from India, and particularly coming from a small town in India. I tend to think about the problems that exist there, and sometimes just problems in my family, things to do with medical issues and things like that. And I cannot seem to connect what I'm doing right now with how I can help with those issues. I know in the longer term things might still connect, but in the broad view of things, but I don't see that connection. So it does bother me whether what I'm doing is worth my time or energy, but I think that doesn't happen too often.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
I think the biggest although I don't struggle with it as much, I think the biggest was family work balance, primarily with my kids as they were growing up. And it became easier as they started to have their own lives and their own friends and their own communities and their own cars, frankly. So it became easier to manage because they weren't dependent on me to manage their activities as well as my activities.
Right. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
The what? Moral conflict?
That you struggle with.
Is it better to work if I'm working at a big company like Google? Am I doing things to make better? Am I making things better, or am I legitimizing bad behavior and making things worse? Yes, that's definitely a moral conflict. If I am living in a country like the US, I feel like, some of these countries are like the modern day aristocracy. So if you look at, people crossing the Mediterranean, dying, boats kind of capsizing and stuff. That's like, people from where I'm from, like Eritreans trying to migrate or like whatever. And I think this is the modern day aristocracy. Like this is, I think it's crazy that we have that society where like there's a group of people who live in countries that are, whose resources are fueling the rest of the world. And so it's just this extractive kind of process where like these resources are being extracted. And those people are not really benefiting from this relationship at all. And then they kind of die like trying to get to these places, right? Like, so, again, like, so living in a place like the US where we basically fled persecution to come here with my family, I always wondered, like, am I perpetuating all of these issues in the world, or am I helping in any way? So those kinds of things.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
I don't know if I struggle with any recurring moral conflicts, but I think it's not really a moral conflict, but the generally like the hardest thing the kind of like the hardest thing day to day is just balancing the different responsibilities and family, and like also wanting to have some time to myself. So like balancing like all the different internal and external demands is difficult.
Yeah. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
I think this, growth as a researcher versus a team leader, right? There's a lot of excitement and fulfillment I receive when I'm solving a problem myself, right? Digging deeper, especially into maybe new areas of math, deriving equations. I was doing theory before, I still do to some extent with my students. But I think balancing doing that on my own versus letting others do it and do it well, right? I think this is something we all grapple. Mm-hmm. That's a delicate balance to be made. But what I tell myself is life is this long marathon, right? So I want to make sure there's enough time for me to think on my own, but also ensure that everybody is supported, right? Yeah. It shouldn't come at an expense that, right, the team is not taken care of.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
Balance.
Makes sense. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
Good question, and I don't think I have one. It could be that I have a very shallow interpretation of life, and I don't know, but I tend not to have moral conflicts. I tend to be faced with a lot of hard decisions and complex decisions but I do tend to make them, and I don't tend to have regrets. I accept that there are consequences to everything I do, and I try to be mindful about them, and I try to look at other people and the decisions they make in the context they're making them. And I accept that we make decisions with incomplete information, and sometimes we make them for the wrong reasons, but I don't think I have a recurring moral conflict.
What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
Modal conflict? What is a...
Like a moral conflict? Something that like where you can't figure out if it's right or wrong or...
I don't know. I usually have pretty strong opinions that I don't feel indecisive usually.
I see. What is a recurring moral conflict that you struggle with?
Conflict. I guess it's a time management. So, and sometimes it's probably envy other people too much. Other people, like for example, you see that, oh, this people has X papers on Y conference, but kind of it's a trade-off, right? So now with family, especially with young kids, kind of keep having this conflict of I want to get things done, and when I get something done, I want to get more things done. So, but you only have this much time. You really have to prioritize in terms of the things. For example, it's very constrained, and the conflict comes from, say, for example, if I want to say have meetings up to 5, up to 6, then my wife would have to give up her free time to look after the kids, and that is kind of create a conflicts, right? So the more I work, the more she will need to work, and it's not easy to look after 2 kids because they are at the age where they will just kind of, if you don't look after them constantly, they will just fight and then they will cry, and a lot of dramas going on. So it really is a full-time job. So that's kind of one of the recurring conflicts that's in my life. And then I think this happens to probably everyone. Yeah.